Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing my June reading wrap-up. In the month of June I read a total of 9 books, 4 non-fiction and 5 fiction. So I'm going to start with the non-fiction. First, I read Squid Empire, written by Danna Staaf. Squid Empire is a book about cephalopod evolutionary biology I decided to read because of Adrian Tchaikovsky, The Doors of Eden, which I read last year. Indeed, this novel features, amongst other things, super intelligent orthocones, a prehistoric species of cephalopod which I found really cool. And, I found other super intelligent animals in that book really cool, but anyway. So cool, in fact, that I thought to myself, well, I like cephalopods, love me some squids and octopuses, but I really don't know much about their ancestors or wider evolutionary history. I should remedy that. Thus, I found Squid Empire, republished more recently, and by more recently I do mean a few years ago already, as Monarchs of the Sea, but I went for the earlier edition because it's the one I could more easily get access to, really. So yes, this is a decently accessible non-fiction primer about the admittedly rather niche subject of cephalopod evolutionary history and paleobiology. Think a book about dinosaurs, but for squid, cuttlefish, nautiluses, and octopus's ancestors. And as a primer, I have to say it did its job splendidly. I learned a lot about cephalopods all they knew, when and how their branch diverged from the rest of the molluscan taxon, how they progressively lost their shells, how competition with bony fish specifically shaped their evolution, and just how dominant and diverse some of Earth's ancient cephalopod groups, such as the ammonoids, i.e. ammonites, actually were. The book also features informative illustrations here and there, and well, basically I got exactly what I wanted out of this. Really? What more can I say? I am now more knowledgeable about head-footers, that's what cephalopod means, past and present, and appreciate them all the more for it. This was a solid 8 to 8.5 out of 10 for me, and I would definitely recommend this book to people with an interest in cephalopods, obviously, or more broadly, paleobiology that isn't dinosaur-centric. After that, I read Testosterone, an unauthorized biography written by Rebecca Jordan-Young and Katrina Karkazis. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. So, reading about the biological bases for gender, or rather the relative lack thereof, either through a neurological or endocrinological lens, is arguably one of the primary focal points of my personal feminist interests. I have now read several books about the complex relationship between biological sex and socio-psychological gender, and I consider titles such as Delusions of Gender or Testosterone Rex, written by Cordelia Fine, important milestones of my feminist journey, though of course I've read other books on that topic. So when I got wind of Rebecca Jordan-Young and Katrina Karkazis' treatise about testosterone and the myths surrounding it, I just knew I had to read it. The thing is, Testosterone, an unauthorized biography, wasn't exactly what I expected it would be. Instead of a comprehensive examination of what testosterone is and does in the human body, both male and female, the book presents an account of how we conduct research into the effects of testosterone, how we ask questions about testosterone, and how we interpret the results of said research, all of which the authors subsume under the umbrella term of T-Talk. The book is divided into 6 parts: female reproduction, violence, power, risk-taking, parenting, athleticism, and don't get me wrong, you will learn some facts here and there about the role testosterone plays in those organic processes, but it isn't ultimately the true focus of the book. That being said, I enjoyed learning about the role testosterone plays in the ovulatory cycle, specifically, and that there is no clear or simple relation between testosterone and aggressive behavior, even in men. Also, while testosterone plays a role in the regulation of sex drive in both men and women, the amount of bioactive testosterone necessary to enact that regulation is actually quite low, and adding more testosterone in will not magically resuscitate flagging sexual desire, again in either men or women, to the great sadness of pharmaceutical companies. I stress these last 2 points specifically because even I, a very gender-critical feminist who believes very few behavioral differences between men and women can be neatly explained by purely physiological differences, not none, but few, used to think there was a solid correlation between higher levels of testosterone in males and a greater potential for aggressive behavior, and another between high T and a slightly higher average libido, or rather a slightly higher and less discriminating libido in men, women being more choosy, but by no means naturally more chaste as such. But actually it seems the available research doesn't even quite support those relatively intuitive claims, so, well, not today, but I learned something there. Of course, the authors only looked at studies involving metabolic testosterone in adults, because that is what was relevant to that specific inquiry, but that means the potential influences of anabolic testosterone during fetal and pubertal development were laid by the wayside, and I felt it stood as an elephant in the room at times, especially when the authors talked about sport and the debate surrounding testosterone levels in competing athletes, female athletes specifically. Speaking of which, I felt the chapter dedicated to athleticism was the weakest. The authors used some bad faith arguments, compared apples to oranges, if you will, and got bogged down in moral philosophy when, honestly, I wanted the book to get back to the science. I understand the book is basically a giant humanities-informed analysis of gendered endocrinology, but it just got tedious at times. This chapter wasn't, in my opinion, as tight as the previous ones, especially as the authors kept coming back to intersex individuals to discuss female athletic performance. And I mean, wouldn't being intersex precisely add a confounding variable to this type of analysis? What were they even comparing then? Also, injecting the woke "science can't even precisely define sex" when the whole book clearly references male and female biology felt really wonky and, quite honestly, virtue signaling-y as fuck. Sue me. I also noticed that the authors conveniently left out the debates currently going on involving transgendered athletes in women's competitions from their analysis. Take that as you will, so yeah, I don't know. That whole chapter just felt off to me, really. So yes, this book is really about the way humans conduct science, the way knowledge is acquired, so epistemology really, and the biases we bring to the table when we do research, especially research which implicates our bodies, our minds, and our often unfair social structures. In that respect, it is a very good book, especially considering testosterone, like any other molecular messenger and regulator, is, at the end of the day, a multi-purpose molecule that doesn't act or react the same way at all times, in all contexts, or in all tissues of the human body. Biochemistry, I should know, is complex, cue my years at university, and you have to factor in different variables such as molecular configurations, receptor-molecule interactions, synergy between different hormones and neurotransmitters, etc., etc. The real takeaway from this book is that there isn't one T, but multiple Ts, and, well, the same goes for estrogen, cortisol, oxytocin, serotonin, etc., etc. Which is also why the promises of so-called biohacking and taking supplemental T are largely bunk as well. And I definitely agree with the authors that we should ultimately ditch the nomenclature of androgens and estrogens, since estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone all exist and work in both male and female bodies. Both men and women need optimal levels of all the sex steroids, so they should just be called sex steroids. Though it's also true they also play roles in other biological systems, but I don't think it's inaccurate to keep calling them sex steroids, since they do have primary functions in the reproductive system. So whilst this was an imperfect read, it was also most definitely a worthwhile one. I gave it a 7.5 out of 10 and would recommend it if you're looking for a largely feminist-aligned analysis of science rather than a feminist-aligned scientific treatise about testosterone in this case. For that, I would direct you towards something like Cordelia Fine's Testosterone Rex, which addresses the subject of testosterone in a more straightforward manner. Then I read Immune. Immune is a book that explores the complex wonders of the human immune system and was written by Philipp Dettmer, the creator of the Kurzgesagt in a Nutshell YouTube channel. If you're unfamiliar with the channel in question, it basically specializes in presenting a variety of science-related topics in very colorful and accessible bite-sized chunks, hence the in a nutshell qualification. Immunology is apparently one of the author's favorite subjects, and this passion definitely shows in the book, which, for a treatise of scientific vulgarization, is particularly accessible and quite thorough in its presentation of the topic at hand. All the principal bases of immunology, one of the trickier branches of medical science, are covered in the book, and whilst I was personally familiar with most of the information, thanks to my course on animal physiology at university, I was happy to get a refresher course on the subject, as I always am, basically. I even learned a couple of new things, such as the terrifying fact that the measles virus can actually wipe out your immune memory, if you're not vaccinated against it, of course. And most people, I hope, in the West are vaccinated against it. I was in any case. On that note, the mechanism of vaccination is perfectly explained, and I dearly hope this kind of information will dispel mild anti-vaxxers' misguided fears on the subject. I say mild because, let's be real, die-hard anti-vaxxers obviously won't change their minds about this. The very colorful, borderline playful illustrations are also a very strong selling point of this book, as they are for the author's YouTube channel, really. I thoroughly enjoyed them, and you know what? I honestly think higher education could benefit from more creatively illustrated academic material. Not that the illustrations I had in my textbooks were bad, but yeah, make them even more colorful and more playful. I think that's a plus. Just my 2 cents anyway. I also really appreciated the fact the book ends with a lovely summary chart of all the specialized cells of the immune system. My only real complaint is a very specific and relatively minor one, and one intimately tied to the fact I am already fairly science literate, and it is that I felt the book was too vulgarized at times. Indeed, the author does a lot of metaphorizing, if you will, to a point where I often felt it detracted from the information being conveyed. Now, I get it. The author, I assume, but to me it was pretty clear that he wanted to make his book as accessible to the widest audience possible, and I commend him for it. Like, making people more science literate is always a good thing, right? But as someone familiar with scientific lingo and terminology, I sometimes just wanted him to ease up on the metaphors and just get to the bloody point. All that aside, though, there's a point at the beginning of the book where the author describes bacteria invading the territory of the human body, running amok and basically crying, "This is our turf now." And he has the human body calmly replying, "I disagree with that assessment." I just pictured a dude in a suit saying that as he basically pushed a nuclear launch button, which in this case would, launch the immune response. But like, yeah, imagine the dude in his office and he's like, "I disagree with that statement." Boom. I don't know. I just thought it was funny. All in all, another worthwhile read. I rated a solid 8 out of 10 that I would definitely recommend to casual science and medicine enthusiasts. Finally, in the realm of non-fiction, I read The Porn Myth, written by Matt Fradd. So, quick bit of background information for this one. I have decided to read 3 books on the subject of pornography and its harms, and I might eventually do an overview video about the topic once I'm done with all 3. And also a bias disclaimer, I already agreed with the base premise that contemporary mass-produced pornography is by and large harmful before going into this book. So I am openly not quite anti-porn, but very, very porn critical. I think there are issues with pornography, both from a production and a consumption standpoint, especially where young people, or let's be real here, younger boys and men, are concerned. Not that women are entirely unaffected, but you know what I mean. Now, The Porn Myth specifically addresses a slew of myths surrounding the subject of pornography, its supposed harmlessness, it's not harmless, the issues with its production, its impact on sexuality, heterosexual relationships in particular, male sexual health, addictive behaviors, so porn addiction, etc. Now, it is written by an openly devout Catholic man, and I was more than a little worried that despite his assurances to the contrary, his religious views would mar the text to a point where it would be completely unpalatable to me, or any other secular reader. But I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised. Yes, this book is definitely heterocentric, and monogamy even marriage-centric, and its thesis does suffer a little bit from this narrower focus. Though ultimately, I do think the focus on male-centric heterosexual porn is somewhat justified, given it is arguably the most harmful. Or, you know, lesbian porn made for men. You know what I mean. It's made for heterosexual men. I also went, dude, your religious is showing a few times, rolling my eyes as I did so, but otherwise, most of the author's myth-busting relies on a wide array of compelling arguments based in neuroscience, addiction science, and lo and behold, even feminist theory. Imagine that, a Catholic male author who presents porn-critical feminist arguments with accuracy and respect, and who cares about the harms androcentric mainstream porn does to women as individuals, and women as a class in an andro-capitalist society. Wonders never cease. For instance, the author did a pretty good job presenting the conclusions of several studies linking pornography consumption to violent sexual behavior, in that it's not so much that viewing pornography will cause a non-violent man to rape out of the blue, that's obvious nonsense, but that androcentric pornographic material does propagate and reinforce rape myths, an abysmal image of women, and a skewed, to say the least, generally violent understanding of sexual relationships. On the other hand, the author doesn't acknowledge the fact that pornography doesn't just influence society, society also influences the content of pornography. And it's clear to me that pornography wouldn't look the same without capitalism or androcracy/patriarchy. That's why I'm not, like, intrinsically anti-porn, but very critical of the way it exists in the world today. I strongly believe it is a feedback loop rather than a unidirectional causal relationship. I greatly appreciated the fact the author differentiated between erotic art and literature and pornography, though he does rail against drawn and cartoon porn in one of his chapters. So each chapter basically busts a myth, if you will. I wasn't entirely convinced by his arguments there, as I personally believe that kind of pornographic material, whilst not necessarily harmless, is a much lesser evil, all things considered, given no human beings are involved in the performances portrayed. Thankfully, because there's some weird shit out there. In any case, my response to whether or not we should consider cartoon porn and things like hentai as bad as film porn is, we need to do more research on the subject. The book's weakest chapter by far was the one dedicated to masturbation, because it's clear the author frowns upon the practice, at least in men in any case. The no-fap movement is referenced, and I'm just not a fan. It seems to me there's some questionable overlaps and concepts circulating in those types of spaces, not to mention spurious claims. My ex David was actually into that stuff a little bit, and don't get me wrong, I was very happy he didn't watch porn, especially coming from a relationship with a man who had a porn addiction on top of his alcohol one, but I do feel his attitude towards male masturbation came from a relatively unhealthy place. I really don't think jerking off is the problem. It's a perfectly natural and healthy part of human sexuality. It's jerking off to gross, degrading, and often misogynistic porn at earlier and earlier ages that is the problem. Plus, my male subscribers, you tell me, isn't it a little insulting to you all to collapse masturbation with porn like that for you? I mean, can't men use their imaginations to wank like most women do? I mean, I think it's a bit reductive, but whatever. Anyway, all that aside, the porn myth was actually a surprisingly solid read that I rated a 7.5 out of 10 and would actually confidently recommend to even secular the readers if they can easily put aside the mild religious flavoring that sometimes pokes its head through the pages. It really wasn't difficult to do, given I otherwise agreed with most of the author's arguments. Comme quoi, you can agree about certain things with people you would otherwise have little in common with, which, in all fairness, is something I already knew, but this book provided a nice little reminder of that. Funny little addendum though, Goodreads, could you please stop recommending Catholic theology books to me, please and thank you. I did not expect that to happen because I read a book by a Catholic author, but algorithms be fucked. Moving on to the fiction now. We have some excellent stuff and some very bad stuff. Interesting month June was. So I read Elder Race, written by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and as you can see, I actually bothered to buy this after I read it on my Kindle because, attention, my fellow bookworms, I have officially acquired a new favorite because I absolutely loved this novella. And actually, I plan on doing a dedicated book review for this one, so I won't go into too much detail here, but suffice it to say that Elder Race was a beautiful, moving, meaning-laden, and thematically rich story. It hit all the right notes for me and had just the right balance, given the novella format, between world-building, plot, and character development. And actually, thinking about it, it almost felt like an Ursula K. Le Guin story in a way, which, if you know anything about me as a bookworm, counts as high praise indeed. Elder Race centers on and fully, oh so satisfyingly develops two primary themes or ideas. One, Arthur C. Clarke's third law of science fiction, i.e. any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. I probably said it wrong, but it's that idea. And what this implies for communicating across time and cultures. And two, the experience and maladaptive management of severe chronic depression. As a sufferer of the latter, I can confidently assert that the representation of depression in this relatively short tale is absolutely superb and keenly poignant. Well, I mean, it was for me. Following Nia's, one of the tale's two protagonists, struggle with mental illness made me feel seen and understood in a way I seldom experience. And though it's interesting that I read this shortly after reading The Magicians, another SFF novel that does a great job of showing what the experience of mental illness, depression more specifically, is like. Also, it's neat that I now have two books I can recommend to those looking for mental illness / depression rep in SFF. This one specifically, though, is even better when it comes to representing depression in the exact way I experience it, which is partly why I loved it so much, and part of the reason why I rated it a very rare 10 out of 10. Then I read Normal People by Sally Rooney. Another one I bothered to buy a physical copy of after reading it on my Kindle, which should tell you something. This is another completely unexpected new favorite in the domain of non-speculative or literary fiction, and as such I also plan on making a dedicated book review for it. This bitch is also another book my now ex David recommended I give a go, and honestly, low-key screw him for knowing me so well and loving me so well when we were together that he knew this book would vibe with me before he ruined it all and broke my heart. No, I will not hide the fact that I projected myself hard onto Marianne, my ex onto Connell, and my dead relationship onto theirs. This novel, dear fellow bookworms, absolutely wrecked my grieving and depressed heart. Like, holy shit, this bitch. I actually had, I kid you not, a meltdown when I finished it. True story. A bit extreme, I know, but that's just how it went. The last time I had an even remotely similar reaction was when I reread Putney at the end of last year. Normal People is a, broadly speaking, a love story, a story of, I believe, soulmates who are complicated and strange people who sometimes wish they were normal. People who struggle with mental illness too, especially Marianne. They fit so well together, but are so young when they first come together that they have to trudge through the social pressures of late secondary school and university in very awkward and at times very emotionally immature ways. They hurt each other without meaning to, but can't ultimately stay away from each other. And I felt all of it. Marianne was also just another one of those rare finds for me, in that I could very strongly relate to her and the way she experienced emotions. Bear with me here, I personally read her as somewhat autistic coded, and yes, I know full well the author didn't write her that way, or at least I'm pretty sure. But sue me, I guess, you know? It made sense to me to understand her through that lens, and that's that. I also really appreciated the nuanced portrayal of Marianne's relationship to sexual dominance and power play, but I'll talk a little more about that in my review. Literary fiction like this rarely works for me, but normal people did, big time, and I gave it an 8.5 out of 10 rating. I was actually tempted to rate it higher, still am, but I'm also still a bit miffed. It wrecked my heart so bloody hard. And now for something very different. I also read last month Manhunt, written by Gretchen Felker-Martin. Oh boy, where do I even start with this one? Well, for one thing, this novel is the worst thing I've read so far this year, by a long shot. And honestly, probably one of the worst things I've ever read in my life, period. Yes, it was that bad. So basically Manhunt is post-apocalyptic horror porn is what I'm calling it. So in the sense that there is a lot of porn amidst the gory horror, if you will, that uses the premise of a gender plague, also very trendy these days, affecting high testosterone havers, to put it simply, I guess, to follow 2 trans women and 1 trans man protagonists trying to survive in a New England that has become governed by so-called TERFs. I decided to read this as a kind of joke, I guess, to partly distract myself from the intense and painful feels normal people was giving me. I'd heard about it through the grapevine, shall we say, thought the premise sounded ridiculous because, let's be real, it absolutely is, and was also intrigued by the controversies surrounding the novel's author. I thus fully expected this to be trash, basically, but god's damn did it exceed my expectations. I plan on doing a, what I'm gonna call For the Lulz and Let Her Rip rant review for this one because A, this novel really needs to be taken to task and picked apart for a couple of different reasons, and B, because venting about this kind of shit is actually fairly pleasurable. So keep an eye out for it in the following couple of weeks. In the meantime, all I'll say, besides the fact this was trash, is that the character work was abysmal, the plot bare bones, the theming level worthy of Twitter, and the world building non-existent. It didn't particularly work as horror. The Walking Dead honestly is gorier than the shit, and the amount of pointless, gross, and fetishistic sex was incredibly off-putting, and I am not squeamish by any means. Hatred and contempt also permeate the pages, but like I said, I'll go into it in a dedicated book review. I gave this excuse for a piece of literature a symbolic 1 out of 10, probably the lowest rating I've ever given to any book. Which, I mean, in itself is quite a feat, I'll admit. After that train wreck, I read The Silence of the Girls, written by Pat Barker. As I'm sure most of you know, mythological retellings are quite trendy these days, but they are not all created, or rather written, equal. I've stated multiple times over the years that I was disappointed by Madeline Miller's Circe, and that I do not agree with all the hype and praise it has received. Furthermore, I have absolutely no interest in reading The Song of Achilles because I have a strong suspicion it will disappoint me too. On the other hand, I did read a wonderful Germano-Scandinavian mythological retelling last year, The Witch's Heart, for which I actually have a review. But I felt I had to try another Greek mythological retelling specifically. So after a bit of research, I opted for Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls. More precisely, The Silence of the Girls retells the story of the Trojan War, so the Iliad, basically, from 2 points of view. That of Briseis, former princess of Lyrnessus, and famed Achilles, her owner and thus rapist. It takes a look at the toll war takes in different ways on female prisoners of war who become slaves and, you know, sex slaves, and male warriors or soldiers who generally suffer, however hardened and violent they may be, from some sort of PTSD. And honestly, well, I thought this retelling would be a lot more female-centric than it actually was. You only get one female point of view, that of Briseis, like I said, and the other point of view is Achilles, one of the original stars of the Iliad. You do also sometimes get a point of view from Patroclus as well. It is clear the author was trying to emphasize the plight of women and girls in war, specifically, or at least, you know, war in the ancient world. And there's quite a bit said about the expected silence of women or the absence of women's voices from legendary stories. But at the end of the day, I felt that emphasis or message was somewhat diluted by Achilles' strong presence and the more general war is horrible message. It's a perfectly respectable theme, don't get me wrong, and it was developed quite well throughout the narrative, but it's just not exactly what I was expecting from this novel. And as a result, I feel the title doesn't entirely fit the story either, actually. That being said, I thought the character work was good, and I was kept engaged throughout the story because of it. The writing was also pretty good, though I did detect 2 or 3 anachronisms or mentions of out-of-place things that took me out of the narrative here and there, such as the mention of, I know it's very random, but bear with me, a mention of killer whales when there are no orcas in the Mediterranean. There's also a mention of kebabs, and I was really trying to rack my brain to figure out whether ancient Greeks would have used the word kebab. That's just how I am. I am a nitpicky bitchworm after all. Also, whilst this story is a mythological retelling, it works principally as historical fiction with a smidge of magical realism thrown in. If you read it, you'll know what I'm referencing. So it's not really mythological fantasy like Circe or The Witch's Heart. Like I said, the author did a good job of exploring and developing the theme of war and its consequences, but I was personally moved more by the adjacent theme of grief. And I mean heart and soul-shattering grief. And even though I contend the novel wasn't as female-centric as I thought it would be, I really appreciated the subtle, what I'll call feminist-adjacent conversation around the price women pay for men's violence, if you will, and the androcratic social conditioning that perpetuates it from one generation to the next, that spins out from the nuanced portrayals and perceptions of the book's 2 main characters. Achilles, Patroclus, and most of the Greek warriors, generals, and kings are all, well, yes, rapists, but they are still human beings as well. Achilles especially was relatable to me because of the grief, earth-shattering grief he felt at losing his basically male soulmate, Patroclus. But, you know, I still strongly disliked him because he is an arrogant asshole with anger and pride issues who doesn't ever think about going against the status quo and raping Briseis, his prize of war. Also, fun fact, I also hated him in the movie Troy, for what that's worth. You also see at one point King Priam saying to Briseis, "Ah, yes, war is very difficult on the women," in an attempt to show empathy for her fate as a female slave, but it just falls woefully short. As a man, and a king no less, he doesn't really understand, which to be fair also makes sense given the time period, the place, and its highly sex-segregated society. Still, I thought all of that general idea was really well executed, and it's definitely transposable to modern times, so that makes it relevant. Overall, I enjoyed The Silence of the Girls, but wasn't blown away by it either, though I definitely preferred it to Circe, that's for sure. I gave it a respectable 7 out of 10 and would recommend it to low on the fantasy mythological retelling enthusiasts. And finally, I read Dark Matter, written by Michelle Paver. Dark Matter is a novel my ex-David once again put on my 2022 TBR, and tells the story of a small amateur expedition into the Arctic Circle, just above Norway, I believe, that becomes haunted during the long, dark polar night. It is a relatively short tale, told through the diary entries of the novel's main character and unique point of view, one Jack Miller, a working-class man with frustrated aspirations to become a physicist who gets hired by the expedition's other members, all upper-class men, to manage its communication apparatus. Dark Matter thus qualifies genre-wise as supernatural horror, and whilst it never quite scared me, simply because it's very difficult for me to be genuinely scared by written horror, it was very atmospheric in a way that strongly reminded me of Dan Simmons' The Terror. In fact, whilst I do think The Terror the superior work, I'd recommend Dark Matter to those who enjoyed The Terror and want a nice nice literary snack that feels, or tastes I guess, similar. The book was well written, very atmospheric like I said, and the author did a splendid job of conveying the sheer, well, terror complete environmental darkness can instill in a person, whatever age they may be. The character work was good, or at least, you know, what it needed to be for this type and length of story. There's even a smidgen of LGBT representation. Not that it really matters so much to the narrative, but a bonus point for unassuming diversity. Let's put it that way. There's also an endearing animal companion element to the story for those who, like me, enjoy such things. I was a bit disappointed by the ending, but otherwise it was an enjoyable ghost or haunting story that featured, you know, the good old man versus nature trope with a bit of supernatural spice. Once again, just like the terror. And, you know, it kept me turning the page and left an overall positive aftertaste in my mouth. As such, I gave it a respectable 6.5 out of 10. Before I close out this wrap-up, I'd like to make a couple of announcements and promote a couple of positive things. I originally made a separate video for this, but I am not quite ready with some of the things I'm going to mention, so I deleted it. I was meant to delete it, but it went up and then I had to delete it. Very embarrassing, so sorry for the confusion if there was any. First, and I know it's not very important, but it matters to me to be honest and transparent about such things, I'm going, as you might have noticed, to change the format of my reading wrap-up thumbnails in that I will no longer insert a picture of myself smiling. Because honestly, these days I feel a bit fake when I do it, and I don't want to be fake. I want to be authentic and genuine. I am doing a smidge less bad because of medication, keeping semi-busy, though that is a work in progress, and meeting other neurodivergent folks, but I remain largely depressed, very tired most of the time, still suicidal at times as well, and you would be surprised the number of times I will have violently sobbed the same day I film the video. So yes, I won't be doing that for the foreseeable future. In any case, you can all see me well enough in my videos, which is what matters most. Second, I would eventually like to create a Discord server to go with my channel. Perhaps a Twitter account, though I've grown less sure about this these past few weeks, so we'll see. The Discord server, though, would ideally be a place where I could foster a nice and cozy little community of like-minded bookworms and, you know, communicate more with all of you. A place where people could, you know, also geek out about a variety of things and engage in I really wanted to be kind and friendly interactions. I will make a proper announcement once I'm generally ready to launch it, hopefully in August or September, depending, of course, on the evolving state of my mental health. Third, I'd like to promote a fellow booktuber called By Book and Bone. She's an Irish biologist with a really nice aesthetic who reads a bit of everything, including SFF, and I invite you to check her out. She's also on Goodreads and Instagram. Fourth, I discovered a while back a really cool Instagram account about foraging wild edible plants called Black Forager. I really like this woman's vibe and energy and enthusiasm, and even though I'm not that interested in the culinary aspects of wild plants, I am interested in the botanical and medicinal aspects of them, and she covers that as well. And finally, I'd like to mention Mars, a YouTuber and Twitch video game streamer whose streams and playthroughs I watch to relax, and I'm sure some of you enjoy video games like me. I discovered her via her very entertaining From Software game playthroughs, which yes, includes a recent playthrough of Elden Ring, but she plays a variety of games, including indie horror and story-led games. Recently, I've been watching her Subnautica playthrough and also her The Corey playthrough on Twitch, and it just helps me to chill, really. I like her energy, her niceness. I mean, she just seems like a genuinely nice person. And watching her content was about the only thing I could do right after David broke our relationship. So yes, it feels comforting. And also, I got my first tattoo a couple of weeks ago, so here you can see it better. So the first of several planned, and it's something I did for myself, and yes, it did make me feel better, and I am happy that it's a part of me because it has a very specific meaning, and I was extremely surprised how little it actually hurt. Like, it was really not that painful, though, to be fair, I might also be hypersensitive to pain because of my autism. but still. Lovely tattoo artist as well. So yes, I'm happy with this, and I already have my next one planned for the end of July. So that's it for this wrap up. I hope, as usual, that you found it interesting, entertaining, that it helped you pass the time. And, well, there's some interesting reads planned for July, but I won't say more than that. I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Genuinely thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all reasonably soon in another video, and I really am going to try to make an effort to do those bloody book reviews, but flagging energy levels, am I right? Until then, bye-bye.